Welcome back, Tribe. We're here with a special microcast. We're back with one of our most popular guests, John Kovacs. We're going to be talking today about violence, real-world violence, and looking specifically at the question of why does the average criminal, the average parolee, or person that's involved in that violent subculture, why are they much more proficient in violence than your average martial artist? John, how are you doing today?
Excellent, man.
Good. Well, glad to have you back, John. So, John, we're just kind of, shooting the breeze here, and we're talking about violence, and we're talking about, the idea that, the average street criminal, parolee, somebody that's done a stint in, is going to be a lot more proficient at violence than somebody that would like to consider themselves, a trained martial artist, even a master-level martial artist. And you and I both have plenty of stories and first-hand accounts of seeing people getting their butts handed to them by people that, if you looked at their paper resumes, they had no reason to be beaten by these people, but they are. So give me your thoughts, John. Give me a couple bullet points. What is it about people that are intimate with violence? What is it that gives them the edge over somebody that is, training for, mock violence?
Well, first of all, what is violence? I mean, it's not something that's playtime in a school where we have fun and associate with other people and have a social outlet, or what I call, martial recreation versus martial art. And I'm not putting it down. I think it's great, as a social outlet. But, it's like most people who might listen to us talking right now have seen the movie Apocalypse Now. And I mean, it's one of the greatest tools to learn about this idea of judgment. Because at the end, when he's training Martin Sheen to do what needs to be done, he says we have to have the willing suspension of judgment. Because it's judgment that really will prevent us from doing the task at hand. And when someone is so-called civilized and we're brought up with ethics and morals and a certain kind of life view, your criminal is not hindered by any of that. If they've grown up with violence, and violence is an expression of their everyday existence, there's no empathy there. There's no sense of judgment. They're just going to act on a very base level and do whatever it's going to take, like a predator to survive. So the whole thing, mostly, first and foremost, is all about the mindset. And the lack of, if we look at criminality and what makes a real criminal, sociologically and in terms of psychopathology, one of the first factors to consider is the lack of empathy. Being able to put yourself in the place of another in terms of what they might experience. You can see that as any of the DSMs that are used for psychological tools to assess people. That's one of the telltale criteria. Someone lacks empathy. It's one of the mainstays of what is real psychopathology. So if you get, your average person who's brought up with a great deal of morality and a great deal of a sense of responsibility, they need to be able to understand the difference between a survival mindset and something that's just recreation. They haven't grown up that way, so they don't understand what it is. And if they haven't experienced real violence, it's going to be difficult for them to click into that a little more, probably a little bit more a level of difficulty than someone who's experienced that in prison or in a bad neighborhood or in a home that's had violence their whole lives. Just stands to reason, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's a very great point, John, because there is definitely, the barrier mentally to engage in violence. And I think where a lot of that comes from is people will look at violence and they'll say, oh, well, a violent lifestyle, that's very bad. That's a very negative thing. And I think the average person, for their own, survival skills and understanding their self-defense, needs to understand that the word violence, it doesn't have to be a lifestyle. It's a tool. And I think when you shift gears and you think of violence as a tool for survival and not as a defining, aspect of your personality or your character, you're able to do that. But as you said, people that are exposed to violence on a routine basis become inoculated to it, and they have the ability, especially if they lack the empathy for other human beings, to enact violence. I read a really great article years ago, and I want to say, I'm not 100% sure, but I want to attribute the article to Pete Kovacs, where he talked about some of the older martial arts systems where the practitioners would invoke the spirit of animals, and they would do this in part as a way to take on, the predatory mindset of a tiger, of a vicious animal, and psychologically be able to divorce themselves from the responsible civilian, part of their psyche, and be able to fully utilize the violence to the level that they would need to be successful and come out of a survival engagement.
Well, certain cultures. I mean, it's part of certain cultures. I mean, if you look at more tribal cultures that perhaps are not heavily influenced by modern technology and modern media and so forth, and they're in some obscure tribe somewhere, it might be easier to just go into that mindset without any sense of guilt or remorse, because it's part of their culture, So it's just a whole different aspect, and we could argue that violence in a certain type of inner city group or prison is a subculture of violence. And the only way to really be top dog versus underdog is to express it through violence. How do you explain, what needs to be done in violence to somebody who comes from a very, wonderful upbringing, and they go do something, it's very much a recreation art for the social aspects or the exercise or the the spiritual, if you can use that word, aspects of the art. And I remember a story years ago, a man with a well-known female, and I'm not picking on the female gender, so don't get me wrong. It's not that I'm doing that, but she happens to have been a female. She was home, and she was been well-known instructor teaching self-defense courses to other females and so on. And she was home. Somebody broke in. She was in the shower. She came out with a towel, and the guy saw her as, so the break-in became a rape situation. And while he had her down and he was, trying to do what he was going to do, she reached up on the table where she was near and grabbed one of those big old crystal ashtrays. And one day my grandmother had a segment of things, multi-colored ashtrays. And that's what she bashed him in the head with, and then for the guy was pretty much out, and she was able to survive that. But, it wasn't necessarily her martial arts skills in terms of, block, kick, punch, chop, and all of that, but it was just her willingness in that moment to not be a victim and do whatever she could to get herself out of that situation. So it's a lot to be said about a survival mindset, I mean, how do we train someone, in a school, in a martial art environment for violence? I mean, I know that when I've taught workshops and I go and I say to people, what do you want to learn? And they say, well, I want to learn real self-defense. I tell them, look, no, you don't. Because if I start going into a real overkill predatory action, they're appalled. They're like, wow, it's too intense. You want to do that. Well, then don't ask for real world violence, because it's ugly. It's not some Steven Seagal movie where you got a pretty ponytail and you come out of something unscathed. I mean, real violence is brutal, toxic. It's very nasty. And it's nothing to do with trying to be pretty or trying to look like, And I'm always interested when someone says, nonviolent, response to violence. What does that mean? What, you're going to do a lot? And be pristine and put someone on the ground and like start to scold them to the error of their ways? And is that what they're trying to propagate? I mean, that's kind of silly, I think, in many ways too.
So, John, I think it's important for people to understand that, you know, the needed experience to enact violence is going to be hard to come by for your average responsible, you know, citizen. I mean, we're not looking to get into these kind of altercations. We're not looking to assert dominance in that way. And it really is a challenge. I mean, you pose a very good question. How do you train for that? You know, I can't train, you know, and recreate the experiences of a career, you know, hardcore, you know, gangbanger, or somebody that's been doing, you know, less 20 years in prison, having to fight every day. You know, it's just something you can't recreate. One suggestion, I want to throw this out there and get your thoughts on it, but one thing that I found helpful for myself, and I want to be very clear with this and explain it, because when I've tried to explain this to people in the past, they often look at me like I'm a little nuts, and they think, you know, that there's something wrong with me. But I think that creative visualization is really, really crucial for developing the ability to do these kind of things. And what I mean by that is, you know, I'll use myself as an example. I'll routinely, you know, run through scenarios in my mind. I'll imagine myself going to the car and getting held up. I'll imagine myself, you know, getting accosted by two guys, or being at the ATM and having to, you know, protect myself there. And as part of the visualization, I try to make it as realistic as possible. I try to imagine the smell. I try to imagine, you know, how warm or cold the air is. And when it comes to the physicality, I try to imagine myself, you know, breaking a bone, striking someone as hard as I can in the throat, you know, pulling someone's hair, taking a bite into somebody's arm, because these are things I can never practice in the dojo. I can't do this. You know, we can simulate things, we can punch and kick, we can put on, you know, impact suits and do those kind of things, but we can never really recreate it. And the only way to recreate it is in the mind. So give me your thoughts. What do you think about that kind of tactic as far as something that can help somebody develop, you know, that type of ability to flip that switch and reach into a different realm and enact that type of violence?
Well, I could easily make the argument just about anybody who's, you know, a practical minded, you know, martial art practitioner does exactly the same thing you just said. You know, we all do it, you know, as a routine. I have it. I just know where the doors are, the exits are, you know, what possible weapons are available, improvised weapons, you know, salt and pepper shaker, a ketchup bottle, a beer bottle, a bar stool, whatever's available at the moment. That's going to, you know, help us, you know, dominate, you know, in that particular situation if something should arise. I mean, it'd be funny to talk to a martial artist who's not real, who doesn't do that, you know, and it all depends on, you know, the type of, you know, locker room banter. I mean, you go into a sport-oriented dojo where it's like sparring, you know, and you might hear something like, well, next time he throws a front kick, I'll counter him with, you know, my roundhouse kick. And, you know, it's all about playtime. But, you know, when you get somebody who's genuinely vicious and you're talking about a combative mindset martial arts school, they're talking a different language. It's more like, well, you know, yeah, I'll take my TDI, you know, gut him in, and, you know, my 380 will come and I'll blow a hole through his eye. You know, it's a whole different mindset altogether. But the thing I'm trying to get at is these things are or should be part and parcel of your education. You know, Albert Ellis in his rational motor therapy is a good point of reference for a lot of martial art people. I used to talk to Carl Sesteri about this a lot. You know, how do you train someone with a right mindset? You know, we talked about the corner draft mentality, and especially for people who can't. People are an interesting species, man, because quite often someone's going to be unable to defend themselves, but if they were put in a position of defending a loved one that they cared about most in the world, and we would do that, you know, with Carl and some of the training. We tell people, you know, look, you know, here's the mindset. You know, you're the only person on the planet that is going to stop this malicious, vicious, horrible character to get to that loved one that you care most about who's behind you. And you're the only barrier that's going to prevent harm to that individual. how far and how willing are you to go to do what has to be done, and that's kind of one good tool to use in a training situation. That cornered rat, that protective mom, over her cubs. What are you willing to do, man? It's like, how far are you willing to go? And remember, man, there's always going to be levels of factors to consider. There's three levels, right? There's crazy, crazier, and craziest. As far as I'm concerned, and you got to ask yourself, are you willing to be the craziest? Most people can go crazy, but can you be the craziest? I mean, how much, Hannibal Lecter squared can you go without losing any sleep? And that's something that's very personal. A lot of times you can't teach that. It's like you get somebody who's a competitor in sports, and they're very into winning. Where does that come from? Is it cultural? Is it genetic? Is it a combination of both? And that goes back to the whole, psychological argument of nature versus nurture, doesn't it? What's truly, innate within us in our DNA, and what's going to be something that's culturally conditioned, or what can we do as a combination thereof to bring out the best out of us in terms of excellence. I remember a story of I think he was a multiple decorated Vietnam War vet, and he was being asked, I think he was a pilot, and they were bringing in female pilots, and the interviewer asked him, well, how do you know you're getting all these women out there who are going to do all these things, and, they're going to fight and be in active engagement with the enemy, how do you know what they're going to do? They're women and all that. And he just looked at the person who said, well, I don't know what I would do, let alone try to second guess, what one of my female pilots are going to do. And that was a beautiful answer. Because here's a guy who's, situations of combat, and yet, to keep it real, he's saying, look, it's unpredictable. We don't know. We just don't know. So I really appreciated that answer quite a bit, because he wasn't posturing or trying to be macho or trying to, put anybody down. He just said, look, the nature of combat is its unpredictability. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. And that's something I want to touch on, is maybe the other side of the coin here. We look at mindset and that embracing of violence, mentally, as one aspect of what makes a person that maybe is not trained in any kind of martial arts, any kind of fighting, very dangerous. And I think the other side of it is, as you said, unpredictability. I recounted a story in one of my books where I was doing sparring with my 7-year-old son. He was 7 at the time, and I have had the blessing of being able to train with who I consider some of the greatest, knife instructors in the world. And I've been exposed to people that are levels beyond me, levels I'll never be able to achieve, but I've learned some good lessons, and I like to think of myself as proficient with a knife. I would spar with my son, and, we were using, safety padded, equipment, and there's no danger to him. Dad's in control of the situation. And he would tag me consistently more than, other people, in my training community, my peers that are at my level. He would get me more often than they would. And I think that one of the reasons is that I've trained for, every possible logical response to, different attack and defense scenarios. And here goes a kid that has, no formal training. He's just a ball of energy, and he's not logical. And so he's using, very unorthodox, attacks and timing and rhythm, not out of any conscious decision, just because he's just very unpredictable. He's a little kid, and he's a ball of energy, and he doesn't know that he's not supposed to do these things. And, he's getting the better of me. And it was amazing, and it was humbling, and, definitely an experience that I try to learn from. But I think that when you look at that, you look at how martial arts are trained, nowadays, and there's a lot of ritual to it, which is necessary, and I'm not knocking it. It's necessary to, to have a starting point. And then comes, past that, what, is referred to, Chad McBroom and I talked about this, and we kind of coined this phrase, is the agreement of movement. if we're going to step to the line and step to scratch, and we're both going to box, and we kind of have an understanding that we're both going to be throwing the correct jab, we're going to be throwing, a correct hook, and that's what we're, conditioned for. We're conditioned to respond properly to a properly executed technique. And when you take that off the table and you get somebody that's just totally unorthodox, it's dangerous, even for the best of us, even for people who have been doing it for a long time. What do you think about this?
Absolutely true. I mean, quite often when you go into a dojo situation, the most dangerous person you're going to get is a raw beginner, man. You go out there and you put on the gear and you fight, you spar, the most unorthodox, as you said a moment ago, and unpredictable, person you're going to fight the beginner, man. Because they're not coming at you with techniques that you're going to be familiar with. And it's definitely not going to be clean. I mean, we go into all these situations and someone, you say, okay, throw a hook punch or throw whatever you're doing to work a scenario out. And, generally there are certain lines of demarcation that are going to be utilized, right? And in reality, who's going to throw a really clean, straight punch? How many martial arts schools still, which is just a mystery to me, they get back and they say, okay, the person steps back and he comes in with a straight lunge punch. Really clean, nice, straight line, wonderful. How many people in real life are going to do that, man? Nobody's going to hit you with a really nice, clean line of attack. It's going to be just chaos. It's going to be like Professor V. It's like a shrapnel, man, from the hand grenade. It's just all over the place, man. And the likelihood of getting tagged is pretty good. What you want to do in anything in real life is, accept the fact that something may happen, but your goal is to minimize. It's like Pereira used to say, okay, you get cut, and you got your 7 layers of skin, and maybe your first 6 get, sliced, but the 7th is yours, and then you do what you have to do as retaliation. And I'm not saying, going with that mindset that we talked about, well, take the cut, and I'm not saying that. What I am saying is you got to expect, that it's chaos, man. It's just chaos. And, you have to pressure test your training, man, in chaos to see, how effective what you're doing is. That's why I'm not a big fan of templates and drill that have a certain timing and a certain rhythm. Because, the second you break that time, you break that rhythm to do something that's outside of that paradigm, that person may not be able to respond because it's not clean enough. Bruce Lee talked about the classical mess, right? He talked about the once, free person is not crammed and distorted by the classical mess. He talked about that on that little tombstone. I think that was by the old school in L.A. I think in Chinatown school, if I'm not mistaken. Someone else might know better about which school that was in, but I know for a fact, that statement is very much attributed to JKB. Once fluid man crammed and distorted by the classical math. And Bruce knew that, which is why he did what he did. Worked broken rhythm, he did different exercises that involved different sets of timing and so on. Because that's truth, that's reality. That's what's going to happen in the real world. Look, you want to pressure test something, you tell someone, look, that's the door. You make a little area that's going to be the door, and you get 3 people that have got to stop that person from going through that door, and you arm one of them with a training blade. And the person coming through the door who's supposed to make it through doesn't know who's got the blade, and you skirmish and let the person try to survive, how crazy is that? You don't even know who's, and you're tuning a little bit because you actually, let the person know that one of the 3 or 2 of the 3 have a weapon and you have to make it through, but that person doesn't know who. So pressure testing something, I think, is crucial. And how many martial arts, scenario-based schools are there that really pressure test what they do? Not that many. A lot of people claim, World War II combatives and all this combative. It's like a very popular word now, combatives. But how many people really keep it simple and pressure test what they do and have the right mindset to make it fly? I don't know, but I think it's important to pressure test whatever you do.
Great. Well, John, that's about all the time we have for today on this microcast. we will be back, and you and I will definitely talk some more on some of these related topics. So again, thank you, John, for being on the show, and we'll be back with the audience in the near future. Thanks again, John.
All right, man. Take it easy.